Think about the last time you were in a group and the thought was already complete in your head, not half-formed or fuzzy, but finished, precise, ready to be spoken. And yet you paused anyway, not because you needed more time, but because something in you wanted to check the room first, to feel who was allowed to go, who already had the floor, who could speak without consequences. And in that pause, your body did what it's learned to do when money doesn't feel secure. It scanned for risk. You noticed the timing, the hierarchy, the invisible order of voices, and even though your idea didn't change, its weight did, because saying it suddenly felt like a decision instead of a reflex, like an exposure instead of a contribution. And when someone else spoke first, often saying something close to what you already had, the reaction in you wasn't surprise or frustration, it was familiarity, because this wasn't about being interrupted. It was about something deeper that had already happened before you opened your mouth. When money feels tight, unstable, or psychologically unsafe, conversations don't just feel heavier, they feel more expensive. And you can sense it in the way you soften statements into questions, in the way you add disclaimers before anyone asks, in the way you rehearse sentences internally and choose the safest version instead of the truest one. Not because you lack confidence, but because your system is trying to minimize loss. The room hasn't done anything yet. No one has reacted. No one has challenged you. But your body is already bracing as if something could be taken, as if being wrong would cost more than it should, as if attention itself is a limited resource you don't have the margin to waste. This is why silence doesn't feel empty in those moments. It feels protective, like a small withdrawal from a situation that could demand more than you're prepared to give. And over time, that protection becomes automatic, so fast you barely notice it happening. You start to recognize the pattern only afterward, in the quiet awareness that you've edited yourself again, that you've let the moment pass again, and that this didn't feel like fear or insecurity. It felt like practicality, like being careful, like reading the room correctly, even though something in you knows the thought was solid, the timing was fine, and the hesitation came from somewhere else entirely. What most people don't realize is that this pattern didn't start in adult conversations. It started much earlier, in environments where money wasn't just a resource, but a regulator of emotion, safety, and consequence, where being wrong, being noticed, or being exposed carried weight that lingered longer because there wasn't much room to absorb it. In households where money was tight, unpredictable, or morally charged, mistakes often felt amplified, not because parents intended harm, but because stress compresses tolerance. And when tolerance is low, errors become events instead of moments. Over time, the system begins to associate visibility with risk, learning that speaking up can trigger correction, tension, or disappointment that feels harder to recover from when resources are scarce. And that lesson doesn't require shouting or punishment, it only requires repetition. Money becomes the backdrop against which identity forms, quietly teaching you how careful you need to be, how much certainty you're allowed to show, and how expensive it feels to misjudge a situation in front of others. Even in families that valued intelligence or education, financial strain often created an unspoken hierarchy of whose opinions mattered most, whose mistakes were tolerated, and whose voice needed to be tempered for the sake of stability. And those patterns taught the system that expression was conditional, not automatic. You may have learned to watch first, to read the room early, to speak only when you were sure it wouldn't create friction, because friction felt dangerous in an environment where there wasn't enough buffer to smooth it over. Over time, this conditioning blurs into personality, so caution starts to feel like thoughtfulness, restraint starts to feel like maturity, and silence starts to feel like self-control. Even though none of those traits were chosen for growth, they were adopted for survival. What makes this conditioning especially difficult to see is that it often masquerades as being considerate, being polite, being grounded, or being realistic, so it's rarely challenged, rarely questioned, and rarely connected back to money at all. The system simply carries forward an old rule that it's safer to speak when you're certain you won't destabilize anything, safer to hold back when you're not sure you can afford the fallout. And that rule stays active even when the environment changes, even when the stakes are lower, even when no one is actually monitoring you. By the time you're older, the original context is gone, but the conditioning remains, so your body reacts to present-day conversations with rules learned in earlier financial climates, treating speech as something that needs to be earned, justified, or softened first, even when the room no longer demands it. Because once money taught your system that safety was conditional, silence became one of the ways it learned to stay within bounds. And that lesson still governs you long after the numbers themselves have changed. What makes this conditioning especially difficult to see is that it often masquerades as being considerate, being polite, being grounded, or being realistic, so it's rarely challenged, rarely questioned, and rarely connected back to money at all. The system simply carries forward an old rule that it's safer to speak when you're certain you won't destabilize anything, safer to hold back when you're not sure you can afford the fallout. And that rule stays active even when the environment changes, even when the stakes are lower, even when no one is actually monitoring you. By the time you're older, the original context is gone, but the conditioning remains, so your body reacts to present-day conversations with rules learned in earlier financial climates, treating speech as something that needs to be earned, justified, or softened first, even when the room no longer demands it. Because once money taught your system that safety was conditional, silence became one of the ways it learned to stay within bounds, and that lesson still governs you long after the numbers themselves have changed. What makes this conditioning especially difficult to see is that it often masquerades as being considerate, being polite, being grounded, or being realistic, so it's rarely challenged, rarely questioned, and rarely connected back to money at all. The system simply carries forward an old rule that it's safer to speak when you're certain you won't destabilize anything, safer to hold back when you're not sure you can afford the fallout. And that rule stays active even when the environment changes, even when the stakes are lower. By the time you're older, the original context is gone, but the conditioning remains. So your body reacts to present-day conversations with rules learned in earlier financial climates, treating speech as something that needs to be earned, justified, or softened first, even when the room no longer demands it. Because once money taught your system that safety was conditional, silence became one of the ways it learned to stay within bounds. And that lesson still governs you long after the numbers themselves have changed. What turns this conditioning into something durable isn't memory or belief, it's the nervous system. Because once money becomes linked to safety, the body stops treating speech as neutral and starts treating it as exposure. When financial stability feels uncertain, even subtly, the nervous system shifts into a protective mode that prioritizes minimizing threat over expressing truth. And in that state, visibility itself becomes a variable to manage. Speaking up raises heart rate, tightens breath, sharpens self-monitoring, not because the situation is dangerous, but because the system has learned that being seen while wrong, challenged, or out of sync can lead to loss that feels harder to recover from without financial buffer. This is why the hesitation shows up before conscious thought, why you feel it in your chest or throat before you can name it, because the decision to hold back is being made at a level designed to keep you safe, not accurate. The nervous system doesn't care whether you're right, it cares whether you're secure. And when money has been coded as the thing that absorbs fallout, anything that risks social friction starts to feel metabolically expensive. Silence lowers arousal, reduces uncertainty, and keeps the system within a narrow band of control, so it's rewarded internally, even as it costs you externally. Over time, restraint becomes regulation, and expression becomes dysregulation, so the body starts to associate calm with staying small, and tension with taking up space, even though the environment no longer requires that trade-off. This is where loss aversion quietly embeds itself into communication, because holding back feels like preserving what little margin you have, while speaking feels like risking stability you don't trust will hold. Present bias reinforces the loop, because the immediate relief of not speaking outweighs the distant, abstract benefit of being heard, so the system keeps choosing short-term calm over long-term presence, teaching itself that hesitation was the correct move. The freeze response deepens here,
not as total shutdown, but as micro delays, softened language, trailing sentences, and internal editing that happens so fast it feels like personality rather than protection. Over time, the nervous system stops waiting for real threat to appear and begins preemptively reducing your presence to avoid the possibility of cost, operating on an outdated map where money equals safety, and safety requires containment. And because this entire process happens beneath awareness, it doesn't register as fear or avoidance. It registers as being measured, being responsible, being in control, even as it quietly trains your body to associate silence with survival and visibility with risk.
Where this becomes more than a nervous system response is at the level of identity, because the part of you that learned to stay quiet didn't just keep you safe, it kept you recognizable, acceptable, and intact inside environments where money set the emotional temperature. Silence wasn't only protective, it was loyal, a way of remaining aligned with an earlier version of yourself who survived uncertainty by staying contained, by not drawing attention, by not becoming a problem that resources couldn't absorb. As income shifts, stability improves, or your competence begins to outpace your expression, that older identity doesn't dissolve. It tightens, scanning for signs that expansion might cost you belonging, approval, or legitimacy in the world that shaped you. This is where speaking up starts to feel internally conflicted rather than empowering, because asserting certainty isn't just a behavioral change, it's a symbolic break from the version of you who learned that safety came from being agreeable, careful, and unobtrusive. The system reads that break as betrayal, not growth, because visibility threatens the continuity of an identity that was formed under financial pressure and rewarded for staying small. When you hold back, even as your insight sharpens, you're not lacking confidence, you're protecting coherence, maintaining loyalty to a past self whose strategies once worked and whose survival still feels owed. This is how identity-based income ceilings quietly form, not as conscious limits, but as internal guardrails that keep your voice calibrated to the level of safety and legitimacy your identity believes it's allowed to occupy, even when your competence exceeds that boundary. Together, these mechanisms form a closed loop, where silence reduces immediate discomfort, reduced discomfort reinforces the belief that silence was correct, and that belief further constrains how much presence you permit yourself, all without requiring conscious thought or deliberate self-doubt. Once these mechanisms lock together, the pattern doesn't stay static, it escalates quietly, because every moment of silence feeds the next one. When you speak less, you receive less, and when you receive less, your system interprets that absence as confirmation that staying quiet was the correct move, even though the silence was self-generated. This creates a recursive loop where reduced expression leads to reduced visibility reinforces the belief that your voice carries less weight, and that belief further constrains how much presence you allow yourself in future interactions. Over time, the environment begins to mirror the restraint you're already practicing, not because people are intentionally dismissing you, but because social systems respond to signals, and hesitation signals low priority, even when competence is high. The more this happens, the more the pattern externalizes itself, so it starts to feel like evidence, like proof that you were right to hold back, even though the conditions that seem to justify the silence were produced by it. This is where the system becomes especially difficult to interrupt, because the lack of response now feels objective, as if the room itself has decided something about you, when in reality, it's responding to the boundaries your nervous system established long ago. As opportunities narrow, not dramatically, but incrementally, your internal sense of capability and your external presence drift further apart, creating a subtle form of cognitive dissonance, where you know you're capable, but experience yourself as less impactful. That dissonance doesn't motivate expression, it intensifies caution, because asserting yourself without prior validation feels even riskier once the gap has widened. Over time, silence begins to shape identity rather than behavior, so you start to see yourself as someone who observes rather than leads, who waits rather than initiates, who contributes selectively rather than fully. And that self-concept further justifies the original restraint. The loop no longer needs financial stress to stay active because it has created its own internal logic, one where speaking feels unjustified without permission, and permission never arrives because the signal never changes, allowing a temporary adaptation to solidify into a long-term structure that quietly determines how much space you occupy in the world. The most unsettling part is that by the time you notice this pattern, it already feels normal because the system that taught you to speak less never framed itself as a limitation, it framed itself as common sense. It taught you that waiting is maturity, that restraint is intelligence, that silence is safety, and because those lessons once kept you stable, they don't announce themselves as outdated. So you continue to filter yourself without realizing it, not because the room demands it, but because your body learned long ago that money determines how much margin for error you're allowed, and that lesson still runs, even when the numbers have changed. The question that lingers isn't whether you have something worth saying. That was never really in doubt. It's why your nervous system still treats your voice like a liability and what it believes would be lost if you ever stopped hesitating long enough to let the room decide for itself.